The knock came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October 1979. Marvin Gaye was still asleep in his Topanga Canyon mansion when IRS agents surrounded his property with the efficiency of a military operation. They had warrants, badges, and clipboards filled with numbers that would destroy his life. $3.1 million in unpaid taxes, interest and penalties that grew by thousands every day, assets to be seized immediately. When Marvin opened his front door, wearing nothing but pajama pants and confusion, he found himself face to face with Agent Patricia Morse, a woman whose job was to collect debts from people who had forgotten that success was temporary, but taxes were forever. She handed him a stack of papers that felt heavier than they should have, documents that would transform him from a millionaire recording artist into a man with $50 in his pocket, running from the only country he had ever called home. The agents moved through his house like surgeons dissecting a body. They tagged his cars, his recording equipment, his furniture, his gold records hanging on the walls. Every physical representation of his success was cataloged, itemized, and marked for government auction. Marvin stood in his living room watching strangers inventory his life, and for the first time since his childhood, he felt completely powerless. The IRS seizure wasn't sudden. It was the inevitable conclusion of years of financial mismanagement, drug-induced decision-making, and a fundamental disconnect between the money Marvin earned and the money he actually understood. For most of the 1970s, Marvin had been one of the highest-paid artists in popular music. His albums sold millions. His concerts grossed hundreds of thousands. His royalties from Motown should have set him up for life. But somewhere between the success and the seizure, the money had disappeared. Some went to cocaine. Some went to expensive cars he bought on impulse and forgot about. Some went to loans he gave to friends who never paid him back. Much of it went to taxes he assumed someone else was handling, accountants and managers who were supposed to protect him but left him exposed. The real problem was deeper than poor bookkeeping. Marvin had grown up poor in Washington, D.C., the son of a preacher who believed that money was the root of all evil. Success had given Marvin wealth, but it had never given him comfort with wealth. He spent money like someone who didn't trust it to stay, like someone who believed that if he didn't use it immediately, it would disappear anyway. When Motown advanced him money against future royalties, Marvin saw it as free money, not understanding that advances were loans that had to be repaid. When record labels gave him signing bonuses, he spent them immediately, not realizing that the IRS considered bonuses taxable income that required quarterly payments. His relationship with money was emotional, not mathematical, and that emotional relationship was about to cost him everything. Agent Morse explained the situation with the detached professionalism of someone who had seen this scene dozens of times. The government would auction everything: his house, his cars, his recording equipment, his personal possessions. The proceeds would be applied to his tax debt, but even if everything sold for top dollar, he would still owe nearly $2 million. There was no negotiation, no payment plan, no celebrity exemption. The law was the law, and the law said Marvin Gaye was broke. The first thing they took was his music room, the sanctuary where he had created some of his greatest work, the Yamaha grand piano where he had composed parts of What's Going On, the vintage recording console where he had layered vocals for Let's Get It On, the guitars, the synthesizers, the microphones, all of it tagged and loaded into trucks. Marvin watched them carry away the tools of his trade, the instruments through which he had spoken to the world, and understood that this wasn't just financial ruin. This was creative death. By evening, the house was empty. Marvin sat on the floor of what used to be his living room, surrounded by indentations in the carpet where furniture used to be. The walls bore the faint outlines of pictures and gold records, ghost images of a success that had never really been his. He had enough money in his wallet to buy dinner and maybe gas for a car he no longer owned. At 40 years old, Marvin Gaye was homeless. The next several days passed in a haze of phone calls to lawyers who couldn't help and friends who suddenly weren't available. The IRS seizure had made the news, and the music industry that had celebrated Marvin's genius was now backing away from his catastrophe. Record executives who had begged for his next album stopped returning his calls. Producers who had fought to work with him acted like they had never met him. Marvin crashed on couches, stayed in cheap motels, and slowly realized that he had no safety net. His first wife, Anna Gordy, was dealing with her own financial problems and couldn't help. His second wife, Janice Hunter, was in the middle of divorcing him and saw the IRS seizure as proof that she was right to leave. His children were too young to understand what had happened, only that daddy couldn't come home anymore. The psychological impact was more devastating than the financial impact. Marvin had built his identity around being a successful artist, someone who could provide for his family, someone who had transcended the poverty of his childhood. The IRS seizure stripped away that identity and left him with the terrifying realization that he was still the scared kid from Washington, D.C., still powerless, still at the mercy of forces beyond his control. Sleep became impossible. Marvin would lie awake in motel beds, calculating and recalculating, trying to find some mathematical solution to a problem that couldn't be solved with math. $2 million might as well have been $2 billion. He couldn't earn that much money fast enough to satisfy the IRS. Even if he released a new album immediately, even if it was his biggest hit ever, the royalties wouldn't come close to covering what he owed. The drug use escalated. Cocaine became less about recreation and more about survival, a way to silence the voice in his head that kept repeating the same message: "You're finished." The paranoia that had always lurked in the background of Marvin's personality moved to center stage. He became convinced that the IRS seizure was part of a larger conspiracy to destroy black artists who had been politically outspoken. His What's Going On album had criticized the Vietnam War, had challenged the status quo. Maybe this was payback. 3 weeks after the seizure, Marvin made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He would leave America. The IRS could seize his assets, but they couldn't seize him. If he couldn't pay what he owed, he would disappear. He bought a one-way ticket to London with money borrowed from a friend, packed a single suitcase with clothes, and walked away from the only life he had ever known. The flight to London was the longest 7 hours of Marvin's life. He sat in coach, staring out the window as America disappeared beneath the clouds, and wondered if he would ever come back. He had $53 in his wallet, no place to stay, no plan for survival, and no idea what he was going to do next. The man who had once earned millions was now a financial refugee, fleeing his own country because he couldn't afford to stay. London was cold, expensive, and indifferent to his problems. Marvin found a small, dirty hotel in a part of the city where nobody asked questions and nobody cared that he used to be famous. He would sit in his room for hours, staring at the BBC News coverage of his financial collapse, watching his reputation crumble in real time. American newspapers ran stories about his spectacular fall from grace. Music magazines published articles about the tragedy of poor financial planning. The humiliation was unbearable. Marvin had spent his entire career crafting an image of sophistication and success. His songs were about love and politics and social consciousness. He was supposed to be above mundane concerns like money and taxes. But the coverage of his financial collapse reduced him to a cautionary tale, a talented fool who couldn't manage his own affairs. From London, Marvin drifted to Belgium, drawn by the offer of help from a concert promoter who believed in his talent and wanted to give him a chance to rebuild. The promoter, Freddie Kuzar, offered Marvin a place to stay and access to a recording studio. It wasn't charity exactly, more like an investment. If Marvin could create new music, if he could make a comeback, Freddie would profit from being the man who had helped him. Belgium provided temporary refuge, but it couldn't provide peace. Marvin rented a small apartment overlooking the North Sea and spent his days staring at the water, wondering how his life had gone so wrong so quickly. The view was beautiful, but beauty couldn't pay bills or satisfy debt collectors or restore his reputation. He was a man in exile, cut off from his family, his friends, his career, and his country. Every morning, Marvin would wake up expecting to be in his Topanga Canyon mansion, expecting the IRS seizure to have been a nightmare. But the unfamiliar ceiling, the sound of foreign voices in the hallway, the smell of Belgian coffee drifting up from the street below would remind him that the nightmare was real. He would lie in bed for hours, paralyzed by the weight of his circumstances, unable to summon the energy to face another day of exile. The apartment became a prison of his own making. Marvin would go days without leaving, surviving on whatever food Freddie brought him, afraid to venture outside because he didn't want to be recognized as the broken man he had become. The few times he did walk the streets of Belgium, he felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life, invisible to people who had no reason to know or care about his American tragedy. The recording sessions in Belgium were sporadic and unfocused. Marvin would work for a few hours, then disappear for days. He was struggling with depression, addiction, and a creative paralysis that came from not knowing who he was supposed to be anymore. The smooth, confident Marvin Gaye, who had created What's Going On, felt like a character he used to play, someone he could no longer access. Money remained a constant source of anxiety. Even in exile, Marvin had expenses: rent, food, drugs, transportation. The small amount of money Freddie provided wasn't enough, and Marvin had no legal way to earn more. He couldn't perform in America because the IRS would seize any income. He couldn't release new music through Motown because they would withhold royalties to pay his debts. He was trapped in a financial limbo that made every day a struggle for basic survival. The psychological impact of poverty was something Marvin had forgotten since his childhood. The constant calculation of every purchase. The anxiety of not knowing if there would be enough money for food tomorrow. The shame of having to ask for help with basic necessities. Success had insulated him from these concerns for nearly 2 decades, but exile had stripped away that insulation and left him facing the same fears he had known as a child. Letters from his children in America became increasingly rare. His ex-wives were telling the kids that Daddy was sick, that he couldn't come home until he got better. But Marvin knew better. He wasn't sick. He was broke. And being broke in America when you owed the government millions of dollars wasn't something you got better from. It was something you ran from, or something that destroyed you. The Belgian winter was brutal. Marvin had never experienced cold like that, a cold that seemed to penetrate his bones and settle in his soul. His apartment was barely heated, and he couldn't afford to keep it warm. He would wrap himself in blankets and sit by the window, watching the sea change colors as storms moved across the horizon, and wonder if this was how his life would end. Not in glory, not in music, but in poverty and isolation. News from America made everything worse. The IRS had auctioned his possessions, but the proceeds were less than expected. His cars sold for half their original value. His recording equipment went to buyers who didn't understand its significance. His gold records, the physical proof of his artistic achievement, were bought by collectors who treated them as novelties. Everything that had meant something to Marvin was dispersed to strangers who had no connection to the music or the man who had created it. The final insult came when Marvin learned that his tax debt had actually increased during his exile. Interest and penalties continued to accumulate even though he had no ability to pay. The IRS wasn't interested in his circumstances or his location. They were interested in their money, and every day he remained broke was another day the debt grew larger. In the small hours of Belgian nights when sleep was impossible and the apartment felt like a prison cell, Marvin would sit at an old piano Freddie had provided and play fragments of melodies that never became songs. His fingers remembered the muscle memory of creation, but his spirit couldn't sustain the effort. Music required hope, and hope required the belief that tomorrow might be better than today. Marvin had lost that belief somewhere between the IRS seizure and the exile, and without it, he was just a man with a good voice and nowhere to sing. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. Marvin had always been surrounded by people, band members, producers, family, friends, hangers-on who wanted to be near success. But success attracted people, and failure repelled them. In Belgium, Marvin was alone with his thoughts, his regrets, and his gradually diminishing hope that things would ever be different. Letters from his lawyer provided updates on legal efforts to negotiate with the IRS, but the news was always the same. No progress, no willingness to compromise, no path back to America that didn't involve paying money he didn't have. Marvin was trapped in a legal and financial maze with no exit, and every day of exile made the maze more complex. The man who had once criticized American society and What's Going On now found himself desperate to return to that same society. Distance had clarified how much America meant to him, how much his identity was tied to being an American artist. But America had rejected him, or rather, America's tax system had rejected him, and there was no appeal process for people who couldn't pay their debts. As winter turned to spring in Belgium, Marvin realized that exile might not be temporary. The numbers that had destroyed his life weren't getting smaller. His debt to the IRS was permanent, insurmountable, and growing. He might never be able to go home. He might spend the rest of his life as a financial refugee, living in small apartments and cheap hotels, forever running from a debt he could never pay. The recording sessions that eventually produced Sexual Healing happened in this context of desperation and exile. Marvin wasn't creating music from inspiration or artistic vision. He was creating music from necessity, from the desperate hope that somehow, some way, he could earn enough money to buy his way back to the life he had lost. But even success couldn't erase the trauma of financial collapse. When Sexual Healing became a hit, when the money started flowing again, Marvin couldn't enjoy it. He had learned that everything could be taken away without warning, that success was temporary and debt was forever. The paranoia that had been temporarily quieted by exile returned with a vengeance, fueled by the knowledge that the IRS was still watching, still calculating, still waiting for their money. The man who returned to America in 1983 was not the same man who had fled in 1979. The Marvin Gaye who came back had been broken by poverty, humiliated by exile, and traumatized by the realization that all his artistic achievement meant nothing when measured against cold financial reality. He had experienced the ultimate powerlessness, not just being poor, but being hunted by his own government for the crime of owing money he couldn't pay. The financial collapse had taught Marvin that he was never really safe, never really secure, never really free from the possibility of losing everything again. That knowledge poisoned every subsequent success, made every dollar feel temporary, made every achievement feel fragile. The $50 he had carried into exile became a symbol of how quickly everything could disappear, how little separated success from catastrophe. In his final years, Marvin would often return to that apartment in Belgium in his mind, to the view of the North Sea and the feeling of having nowhere to go. The memory of that exile, that financial death, lived with him every day, a constant reminder that the boy from Washington, D.C. who had been afraid of poverty had been right to be afraid. Poverty had found him anyway, had followed him to the heights of success and pulled him back down to earth. The IRS seizure and the exile that followed were more than financial events. They were psychological earthquakes that shattered Marvin's understanding of himself and his place in the world. He had believed that talent was enough, that creating beautiful music would protect him from ugly realities. He had learned that the world didn't work that way, that beauty and talent meant nothing when the bills came due. That knowledge changed everything that came after. Every song, every performance, every relationship was colored by the memory of sitting in a Belgian apartment with $50 and no way home. Success, when it returned, felt borrowed rather than earned, temporary rather than permanent, fragile rather than secure. Marvin Gaye had survived his financial collapse, but he never recovered from it. The man who came back from exile was a different man entirely, forever marked by the knowledge that everything he valued could disappear in a single morning with a knock on the door and a stack of papers that weighed more than they should. The scars of that Belgian exile never healed. Even after Sexual Healing brought him back to commercial success, even after the Grammy wins and the sold-out concerts, Marvin carried the terror of that empty apartment with him everywhere. Friends noticed he would hoard cash, keeping thousands of dollars hidden in different locations, paranoid that the IRS might return without warning. He could never again enjoy the luxury that success provided because he had learned how quickly luxury could become memory. The man who returned to America was fundamentally different from the one who had fled. Where confidence once lived, suspicion took root. Where artistic freedom once flourished, financial anxiety now strangled every creative decision. Marvin would check his bank balance obsessively, multiple times a day, as if constant vigilance could prevent another collapse. The $50 in his pocket during those dark months had taught him that everything he thought was permanent was actually borrowed time. In his final years, when the pressures mounted and the demons closed in, those Belgian nights would return to him in dreams. the cold apartment, the endless sea, the crushing weight of having nowhere to run. Financial death, he had learned, was a kind of murder that left the victim walking around afterward, forever changed by the knowledge that safety was always an illusion.